Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. We are Torchbox and we're here today to talk to you about measurement and about how you can measure your impact online through better, more meaningful, more thought out measurement. Specifically today, we're going to talk to you about measurement within the context of digital marketing because of who Torchbox are and what we do. But the principles we're going to cover really apply to any form of outbound comms your charity might be doing today. So I hope that if you're not specifically working within a marketing space, you'll still have stuff to take away from today's session. Before we just start, just a quick note about questions. There's two of us on the call, both of us are going to be co-presenting, so we'll have limited ability to interact with questions. But if you could use the chat function to put any questions you have to us, and we'll try and answer those either throughout the session or in the minutes at the end that we have time to do so. Anna, could I ask that you just mute your mic quickly, if that's okay? Thank you. All right, so a quick introduction to us. Hello, I'm Phil. I'm the Director of Digital Marketing at Torchbox. I've been with the company for 7 years, and it's my responsibility to oversee the direction and delivery of the digital marketing work we do. I'm going to be talking for the first 20 minutes or so to you before I hand over to my colleague, Amna.
Hi everyone, I'm Amna and I'm the Head of Digital Acquisition at Torchbox. So I'm responsible for the direction and the success of our digital acquisition offering, which covers PPC, paid social and email marketing.
So a very quick introduction to who Torchbox are. We are a digital marketing agency who work with non-profits in the UK and around the world. We work with a very wide range of non-profits, ranging from service user-centered charities like Breast Cancer Now and the Samaritans, think tanks like Chatham House, Nuffield Trust and the Health Foundation, and organisations like the Disasters Emergency Committee and Islamic Relief UK, who are humanitarian aid appeal charities who respond to major disasters and humanitarian crises around the world, like tsunamis and Myanmar and situations like that. Today's presentation is rooted in the experience that we have with working with each of these very different non-profits to deliver marketing campaigns that are super measurable and deliver real impact, whatever impact might mean to that charity. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk to you about the different stages of measurement we work within in a marketing context at Torchbox. And we're going to start at the beginning, or rather we're going to start where we think the beginning is, by looking firstly at why we measure. So this is really different to where most charities begin when it comes to measurement. In the first part of today's session, I'm going to talk about some of the issues we often see in the gap between what we talk about, we refer to as reality versus aspiration in terms of measurement. And by that, we mean the reality of what the folks on the ground are measuring in dashboards and monthly reports versus what senior stakeholders and leaders at organisations have stated that we're all collectively working towards as a charity. Now, it's that gap, which is an overwhelmingly large and common one in the non-profit sector, that underpins Torchbox's approach to data and measurement. From here, Anna's going to take over and talk about what to measure. So she'll be trying to encourage you to look at ways of measuring that improve the things you report on and the quality of the data that you have to work with. It'll be a much more practical focus, a series of tips and tricks looking at Google Analytics and the Facebook interface in terms of what you can measure that will hopefully turn good measurement into great measurement. And lastly, we're going to finish up with a short section just briefly touching on how to bring this all together visually and how we can use data visualization in the form of Google Data Studio dashboards to build reporting dashboards. We're going to show you some examples of the different things we've done beyond just where does the traffic come from in that platform that will hopefully give you more meaning and actionable data to use. So we have an awful lot to get through today. I believe the slides and the recording will be shared after this, by the way. So if what we're saying is going too fast, then it will be shared after. And we're happy to take questions in the chat, and also our emails are on the slide deck. Mine is phil@torchbox.com. I'm totally happy if you want to get in touch after this and ask questions about anything we've covered, then please do. So first up, why do we measure? So I want to start, and I want to center my section of today's presentation around a real story about a real client of ours. Last year, I was approached by a large charity and asked if we could audit their organic social media channels to understand, quote unquote, how each channel is performing. We agreed to the work, obviously, and we're often asked for to deliver those kinds of pieces of work. And we naturally asked, the first thing we said was, well, okay, great. Can we see the KPIs and the objectives that you're working towards as an organization? What have you defined? What are you working towards internally? So we can understand how each channel is performing against these. Our charity came back to us with 5 different objective-focused documents, all of which had strategic in the title, all of which contain different metrics grouped together in different ways, in different places, pulled from different platforms, some of which were even called Phil's KPI tracker. They were someone's, they were named for them. These were all from staff in the same team in the organization. And it became very clear that what we were looking at, we were working with a team who hadn't collectively agreed on what success looks like. And they hadn't asked things like, how do we know we've succeeded? And they really hadn't asked, why are we measuring these things? I wrote a blog post at the time on the Torchbox website in which I summarized it maybe a bit too brutally as, so what? Who cares? I'm going to outline how we took this issue as a starting point, and we worked with the charity to develop what we refer to now as a digital marketing measurement framework. Okay, so here are some metrics. There are lots of things you can measure, and I guarantee that you and your organization, or someone at your organization is probably measuring most of these things. You'll be tracking your followers on social media, and someone somewhere at your charity will be reporting on or monitoring traffic by country or city if you're UK focused. And you might even have an agency telling you what your cost per click is for a Google Ads campaign. So these metrics are all pulled from a dashboard that charity I've talked about had built. And this was the dashboard to end all dashboards. It was someone's life's work. I marveled, I swooned when I saw it, because I've built similar dashboards for our charities in the past. And it was the dashboard to end all dashboards, and it was called the Digital Transformation KPI Tracker. It was a very grand title. Now, from that title, it would be fair to infer that were you to deliver against these metrics and the graphs were to go in the right direction, digital transformation, which is a really a very commonly used term, digital transformation would be bestowed upon this charity. But for some reason, despite that dashboard, that charity wasn't yet digitally transformed. 3 things to note. Number 1, some of this data is not very useful. It has no meaning. It doesn't really tell you anything about whether the marketing campaigns you're running or the activity, the outbound comms you're running is successful. And you would never use these metrics as firm primary success metrics in fundamentally answering the question, why are we spending money on this digital marketing campaign? Pages per session is an example of a metric there. Point number 2, you can't change some of this data, or rather, you as marketers and anyone involved in your specific part of your organization can't change that data. Your bounce rate might be rubbish for the landing page you've used, but you can't change that with the tools you have at your disposal in marketing. So new creative or tweaking the CTA or trying to improve the targeting will not move the dial on many of these metrics. Most importantly, most of this data has no connection whatsoever to what your organization is working towards. And specifically, your senior management don't really care about these metrics. Now, if you're measuring things that have no direct link to your organizational objectives, you're going to fail. You're never going to be able to really understand if what you're doing is working. And instead, you're just going to have a series of metrics that you passively monitor. You're going to struggle to keep making the case for investment in digital marketing. Now, on one hand, that's more media spend for Facebook ads, but on the other, we often hear, oh, we're making the case internally for a dedicated social media officer or marketing head of marketing. If you're not making the case through metrics that tie back to organizational objectives, you're really going to struggle in the long term to get this buy-in. Here is a man called Neil Patel. He is an analytics evangelist. He's an ex-Googler. He's a massive name in the world of digital measurement. And if you've never heard of him, if you aren't signed up to his his newsletter, then go ahead and sign up to that. It's really brilliant, and he talks about the concept of a digital ninja, which feels like something tangible I'm aiming to become one day, but it'll help you become a digital ninja. And he sums up the point I'm trying to make here when he says that the root cause of failure in most digital marketing campaigns is not the lack of creativity in the banner ad or TV spot. It is quite simply the lack of structured thinking about what the real purpose of the campaign is, and a lack of objective set of measures with which to identify success or failure. It's the word structured here that we really care about. And we use this as our starting point when we begin putting together what we call our digital marketing measurement frameworks for our charities. So this is a mouthful, a digital marketing measurement framework. A measurement framework is a series of objectives under which sit goals. Goals are things you're going to do to achieve your objectives. And under these sit your metrics, which are often referred to as KPIs. A few confusing terminologies, and we're going to keep coming back to these as we go through this presentation. We're going to look now at how you can start thinking about structuring your own measurement framework that works specifically for your charity. And we're going to show you what one of these looks like in real life too. So the first step, number one, find your organizational objectives. Establish which of these your team's work can influence and rewrite slightly if necessary. So the really important part here is to firstly, how you measure, how your framework is built. It needs to be intrinsically built upon and centered around your organizational objectives. So start here, look at your annual reports, look at the vision documents and the mission statements and the stakeholder review reports that come out from your senior leaders. That's there, it is all in there. That is where you begin. So let's specifically look at the charity's organizational objectives, the charity that we're talking about. Here they are. This is what we had to begin with when we dug into the vision documents that they had. They're pulled from this 3-year vision that the director of the charity we were working with published, and he believes that the organization we're working with should, number one, build a strong and sustainable funding base to support our work over the long term. This is specifically about income. Number two, engage not only decision makers and influencers, but also the interested public and younger people. This is exactly what it says. It's about engagement. So whether that's service user-led content being read or it's petitions being signed, whatever that physical thing is or the act of doing, at some level, he wants to engage target audiences. And in this case, and this is an important part when we look at building a framework, he's gone as far as to outline who those audiences are in his vision. Let's look again at those metrics from that dashboard we saw at the beginning of our work with our charity. Now, some of these will make it through into a final framework, and some of these your charity and this charity will always continue to monitor and measure. But what's really interesting about the charity I was working with when we looked at the doing on the ground, the reality, the metrics in the dashboards versus these organizational objectives was when we were asked to engage with an organic social media audit, it turns out that this organization was never using social media channels to serve against objective one, to generate funding for the long-term health of this organization. So their predominant outward-facing channels played absolutely no role in delivering against a central organizational objective. And that, to me, for an organization of world repute, felt completely unacceptable. Now, there was a really simple reason why when we dug into this. We went back and we said, hey, look what we found. The owners of these channels said, oh, yes, that we know that. We're worried about the impact that talking about kind of money and funding and income will have on our reputation. We don't want to look too salesy. And I've heard that in charities, big and small, that there's some degree of embarrassment in talking about income and donations. But what they weren't doing, they were doing nothing at all to serve an organizational objective via their social media channels. And if we hadn't gone through this process and started at the root, we would never have exposed that. So we went back to those organizational objectives and we began building their measurement framework. And here's what that looks like. Now, I'm sorry if this is a little bit small on your screen. Again, the slides will be shared, so hopefully you can try and see some of the detail here. I'll point to one. I'll kind of guide you through what I'm looking at here. But here's what our framework looks like. It's a very, I could only pack a small bit of, or a tiny bit into a screen grab. It's a lot bigger than this. I've highlighted one of the objectives. There were 3 objectives that we came out with from those 2 objectives. And the first objective was to reach and engage target audiences on third-party owned platforms. An important distinction that we made between third-party, so social media channels and PPC channels, versus, I guess, first-party, which was in objective 2, was the website, which came into objective 2. This is about third-party owned platforms. And what you'll maybe notice here is that this objective doesn't refer to young people, decision makers and influencers who were referred to specifically and explicitly in the organisational objective. This is an important point because we chose to remove that audience overlay segmentation, which seems like a kind of counterintuitive thing to do because your charity will have very specific audiences. However, there are 2 reasons we did this. Firstly, we needed to keep, well, firstly, those audiences might change over time, and particularly during events like COVID, which we couldn't have seen, lots of charities' audiences became quite different. And if we had locked this to a specific set of audiences, it may not be able to serve those audiences correctly. But more importantly, if you try and build a framework of measurement and objectives and KPIs for every single one of your audiences, it will become too big and it will become too unmanageable. When fundamentally the things that you're going to use, the KPIs and the objectives, are broadly the same, whether you're targeting students or whether you're targeting the over 65s. You will need to overlay some audience segmentation when you come to build a campaign and brief in a campaign. But at a root level, the metrics you measure, the things you choose to track in Google Analytics will be the same. Step number 2, once you have these objectives, is to establish corresponding goals under each objective. And your next job is to list the things you're going to do to achieve that objective. To achieve our objectives, we will do the following. And again, back to our framework, here's what that looks like. In this case, we have 3 goals that sit under this objective. Only 2 of these I could get into the screenshot, but the first of these is 1, to deliver audience growth on and via third-party digital platforms. Growth. Goal 2, use third-party platforms to maximize visibility of the charity with existing and new audiences. And goal number 3 was around engagement. Audience growth, number 1. Visibility of the charity with that audience that we've grown, number 2. And then audience engagement once we have grown and made sure our content is visible to that audience. Now, what's really important here and what we learned going through this process is to use language that matters to you when you build these frameworks. In this case, under the heading goals, we have spelt this out. To achieve our objectives, we will do the following. It's really important to not get lost or overwhelmed by what a goal is compared to what an objective is, compared to what a metric is versus what a KPI is. Your head will explode if you get too involved in that. And they will mean different things in different frameworks. So try and use statements or take the liberty to use statements and language when you build these kind of things to explain clearly what that means to you as an organization. Step number 3, define robust KPIs. So these are metrics that indicate whether a goal has been met at a channel by channel level. So here we have, well, this is a really important thing. What's really important here is that now, and only now, do we define robust KPIs. It's time to look at metrics last. So I commented at the start of this conversation about where you begin, and if you take one thing away with you here, it's don't begin with metrics and KPIs. These have to come last, and they exist to serve the objectives and goals you've defined. End with metrics and KPIs when you build this. They should not exist independently anywhere. And there are a couple of points to note here. I've used the word robust, and this is really to encourage you to raise your threshold for success. So somewhat unbelievably, these change over time. Facebook changes the wording a bit slightly in the name of the metric, but somewhat unbelievably, if you were to log into Facebook's advertising platform now, you will see that under the video metrics, if you're running a video campaign, there is a metric called 2-second continuous video plays. It's a big Big achievement to get someone to watch 2 seconds continuously of your video play. Now, when you look at what's that's defined at, if you weren't happy enough with that as a success metric, that's the number of times your video was played for 2 continuous seconds or more. Most 2-second continuous videos will have at least 50% of the video pixels in view. So what that metric means is that 2 seconds of your video was viewed in half a screen. It's crazy to think that the default metrics, lots of the default metrics are at that level of robustness. And fear not, Facebook have a metric now called 3-second video plays. If 2-second video plays is not quite enough engagement for you. My point here is that you will need to do some manual calculation when you come to create these metrics. The second point here, and as illustrated by this screen grab, hopefully, is that you need to define metrics at a channel by channel level. And this is important. So let's look at this. Let's just look at this framework. We have a column here for measurement tool, because each of the different platforms that we expect our charity and your charities to be active on have got different metrics. And all of the channels measure things in slightly different ways. And video views on YouTube means slightly different thing to Twitter and to Facebook. So the process here is that once you have your objectives and your goals that sit under them, list the channels you're active on or you think that you're going to be active on. That's in our measurement tool column there. And then go through and trawl each of the channel's analytics capabilities and the help guides to pull out the metrics that indicate real success. And if the metrics you're working with in these platforms is not robust enough, if 2 or even 3-second video views is not quite enough for you, I'm pleased you're on the right track. Manually calculate your own metrics. So you may not be able to see that in here, but we have things like cost per lead and cost per follower that have been manually created, and we do some manual calculation. There's an extra column here, what does this metric tell us, and one hidden as well that we didn't have time to talk about, which is around how would you change this metric through digital marketing. We've already talked about that, but write out what the metric means to you as well. What does this metric tell us? And make sure you can answer, how would we ever move the dial on this metric? What could we do as a measurement, as a marketing team to change this metric? So before I hand over to Amna to finish, let's just define some rules once you have built your measurement framework and you're happy with it. The first thing is you're going to need to assign someone as the absolute gatekeeper of this framework. They need to own it. They need to have the authority to be able to talk about it at all levels within the organization. And they will need to have the ability to reject the equivalent of scope creep when someone needs to add metrics in. You need someone to own this framework internally. Secondly, you're going to need to design a briefing template around this, and you're going to need to think in terms of primary metrics and contextual metrics. I'll come back to this. Thirdly, you're going to need to reject campaign briefs 100% that do not adhere to this framework in order for it to work. So I want to wrap up just talking about this second point here, which is around primary metrics and contextual metrics. I really want to encourage you to start thinking about these 2 different types of metrics. If you are running 2 campaigns throughout the year that are focused on donations, and you do one in February and one in November, ultimately you have a primary metric. All that really matters is revenue or donations or income. Were you to just report on that metric, you would have no use for that data. It would be not useful. It would be out of context. You're going to need naturally to bring in secondary contextual metrics that allow you over time to understand the nuances of campaign A compared to campaign B. So contextual metrics explain why your primary metric, revenue, was high or low. And it can really help you. They can really help you diagnose why campaigns didn't work. They are important and they're necessary, but remember, they are contextual, so they don't indicate success alone. So just to finish, I wanted to just show you what a briefing template looks like that accompanies this. So this framework, in order for this not to sit on someone's emails as an attachment and never be thought of again, you're going to need to build a briefing form that will help your marketing team and the people who brief into your marketing team to use this tool. So you'll probably see something like this before at your organization, but it lists out name and project lead and the budgets and the start and end dates. But specifically, we have chosen to include digital marketing objectives, and number 1 here is reach and engage target audiences. So these are drop downs that they can select from, and they directly match what's in the framework. The briefer inner can then select the digital marketing goal that matters. And then lastly, they can begin to select the KPIs primary and the KPIs contextual that they believe that will indicate success for this campaign. And in the case of the charity that we're talking about, lots of different people brief into the marketing team, and they don't necessarily have this understanding at the level that the marketing team do. So that can be, this section can be completed by you as marketers or your marketing team. All right, that's it from me on the whys. I'm going to stop and hand over to Amna now. I hope that's been useful for you as a kind of guide to the basic layer that you need to do before you begin thinking about real measurements. Next, we want to get you thinking about what you measure. So I'm going to hand over at this point and give Amna the screen sharing power, somewhat clunkily. And hand over to you, Amna.
Thanks, Phil. I'm just going to share my screen, and if you can, Phil, give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Awesome. Okay, so now you have your measurement framework in place. It's time to look at 5 practical tips for how you can improve your measurement. So tip number 1, make UTM tagging your North Star across your organization. We've put this first because not only is it the most powerful tool you have for attributing marketing success to specific campaigns or platforms, but it's also one of the easiest tools to implement, yet time and time again, we see this forgotten about in many organizations. Quickly, for those of you who don't know what UTM tagging is, it's a bit of code that you add to the end of your URLs to track the performance of your campaigns. And it looks a little like this. I won't go into too much detail about what each of these parameters are used for, but by using UTM tagging, you can specify where the traffic has come from, how the traffic got to your site, and what campaigns drove that traffic. And while it looks a little messy to humans, this is how Google Analytics will output this data. You'll be able to view and compare the performance of each of your campaigns against your goals. And you can break the campaign performance down on a more granular level by looking at the channels that were part of that campaign and how they're performing. It can really help you understand what elements of your campaigns are performing and which aren't, and where you need to be investing your time and money. It's really a fundamental component of accurate measurement. However, it only works if UTM tagging is implemented correctly and consistently across your organization. Otherwise, you end up with something a little bit like this in Google Analytics, where if you haven't consistently or correctly tagged your URLs, Google Analytics will just dump everything in this other folder because it doesn't know how to categorize it. And that makes it incredibly difficult to extract useful data. There are a number of tools that you can use to help implement and manage this across your organizations, which you can look into. At Torchbox, we set up our clients with a centralized spreadsheet, which is also very effective. Tip number 2, implement pixel tracking for all marketing platforms. So by default, there are a handful of metrics available within channels like Facebook, Twitter, and Google Ads. And as Phil mentioned earlier, we see many organizations be led by these default metrics and base the success of their campaigns on them, partly because they're readily available within the interfaces. The problem is metrics like clicks and click-through rate only tell you half of the story. They tell you how users have engaged with your ads and campaigns, but not what they've done next. So you're not able to answer important questions like how many users made a donation or signed up to our event? What was the value of that interaction? Who was our valuable audiences, and which creatives drove the better results? These are the questions that are really going to give you an indication of success for your campaigns, but they'll also help you optimize and run far more effective campaigns. And the way to expose this data is by implementing the pixel for each platform on your website. You can do this through your developer or using Google Tag Manager, which is our preferred option. And once it's implemented, you can set it up so it pulls interactions from your website directly into the interface, allowing you to measure the success of your campaigns, audiences, creatives, and much more. So here is just one example of where we've used the Facebook pixel. So here is a coronavirus appeal campaign that we were running. The focus was on driving revenue. So what we did was configure the Facebook pixel to pull in donation values from the website, allowing us to understand which of our audiences generated the most revenue, where to put our efforts, and to create a custom column in Facebook that calculates return on investment for our activity. And without this data, our ability to measure the success and optimize our campaigns would be limited. And there are lots of other ways you can use your Facebook data, like for remarketing, for example. I'm not going to go into that today, but you can get a lot of data from just implementing your pixel, which will be really beneficial for your measurement and your activity. Tip number 3, implement e-commerce tracking. At a basic level, the benefit of e-commerce tracking is that it allows you to measure the profitability of each of the channels that you're operating on and the campaigns that you're running. And you can understand which of your products are more popular. And just to clarify, by products, I don't just mean shop products. These can also mean types of donations like one-off or regular giving. But not only that, e-commerce tracking allows you to calculate metrics like return on investment, which are just not readily available in Google Analytics. So you can begin to ask yourself whether your campaigns and channels are delivering a positive return on investment. A more advanced version of e-commerce tracking, called enhanced e-commerce tracking, allows you to take this data a step further and begin analyzing user behavior. So, for example, you can analyze which products have been added to your basket and then abandoned, which might help inform some of your remarketing strategies. And you can identify where the pain points are on your website, because trust me, it's not always the poor creative that don't drive conversion. Sometimes it's something just more fundamental than that, like how a user is engaging with your website. So here is what this funnel looks like in Google Analytics. You can see the different touch points in the journey and where the different drop-off points are to help you analyze and optimize your website to improve the conversion rate. This data can only be exposed through investing in e-commerce tracking. I have a bit of a bonus tip here, actually, which I know that some interactions and transactions on the site can't be tracked in full. That might be because the transaction takes place on a third-party platform, like a challenge event. In this instance, what we recommend that you do is use a minimum value, like a fundraising amount or entry fee amount, to populate the value field in Google Tag Manager. Basically assigning a value to that interaction, like a button click out to that third-party site, to just give you an indication of what the value is of that interaction. We call that a soft revenue at Torchbox. Tip number 4, understand attribution modeling. So let's begin this tip by looking at what attribution modeling is. So Google describes attribution modeling as the rule or set of rules that determine how credit for sales and conversions is assigned to a touch point in the conversions path. And by default, the attribution model in Google Analytics is last non-direct click. Essentially, that means Google Analytics will ignore any direct visit and assign credit to the last channel before conversion. I'm going to put this into maybe a bit more of a simple scenario. Here's a pre-COVID example of how you might have got to the office. I'll probably need to update this for a post-COVID world, but you would leave your house, you might get on your bike and cycle to the train station. You might walk 20 minutes down the road to your building and then take a lift to the 3rd floor up to your office. In Google Analytics, it would be the lift that received all of the credit for taking this person to work. But that just isn't right, because all of the other touch points contributed to getting that person to work, but they don't get any of the value for it. And if we translated this to a marketing campaign, in this case, Facebook would receive 100% of the credit, despite the fact that there were other channels involved. And in Google Analytics, there are a number of different attribution models that you can use that allow you to compare how the different models impact the value of your marketing channels. I'm not going to go into all of them today, but I'd strongly recommend taking some time to understand this and establish which attribution model is right for your organization. At Torchbox, we mostly use the last non-direct click conversions, but we also report on assisted conversions. So we recognize that there are other channels that play a part in the final conversion. And tip number 5, improve the measurement of your content. This is one of my favorite tips because it can make a huge difference to how you view your content. So typically when we start working with charities on their data and measurement, there are always a set of metrics that they use to measure the success of their content. And I'm going to just beat up a little bit here on bounce rate, because one of those metrics is bounce rate. But there's also others like page views or how long someone has spent looking at that page. These metrics are all well and good, but what happens if you have a long form piece of content that a user finds really, really interesting? They read the whole page, absorbing every word, and when they're done, they click back to Google and continue with their day, but they're still thinking about this piece of content that they read on your website. In Google Analytics, this would be seen as 100% bounce rate. But that's just not an accurate reflection of how this user is engaging or viewing your content, and not an accurate reflection of how this content is performing. What if you completely removed this page because it had a really high bounce rate, or optimized it because of that one metric? And don't get me wrong, bounce rate can be really useful when paired with other metrics. But you can take this a step further to really understand user behavior and the performance of your content. But before you do any analysis of your content, ask yourself a few questions like, what's the purpose of this content? What do we want users to do on the page, and what interactions can we measure? And once you have the answers to that, you're in a kind of a good position to start planning the measurement of that content. And one rule actually to remember is that it's almost any interaction on a website is trackable some way. So going back to this piece of content, the main interaction a person is taking on this page is that they're scrolling down the page. So you can set up something like a scroll depth tracking that negates the bounce rate when a user has scrolled down a certain way down the page, so you know they've engaged in some way. This could be if they've scrolled down 50% or 75%, whatever the metric is that works for you. But implementing this sort of measurement would be a much more accurate reflection of how this content is performing, rather than just looking at bounce rate alone. Okay, so before we wrap up, we just wanted to show you a few ways of how you can present some of the data that we've talked about using a tool called Google Data Studio Dashboard, which we're massive fans of at Torchbox, because we understand that not everyone in the organization is going to be able to, log into Google Analytics and pull the reports and the data that matters to them most. So Google Data Studio can really help with this. So here are a few examples of how hopefully it will inspire you to create your own. Firstly, here is an example of where we've used Google Data Studio to benchmark our campaigns. For this client, we've pulled in the report for each of the campaigns we've run, so we can clearly compare ROI figures, cost data, and revenue data. And based on this, we can understand whether a campaign is performing well against previous campaigns. And we can answer questions like, if we spend this much on advertising, what's our return likely to be? Here's a screenshot of a dashboard we created to monitor the impact of a cookie management platform that was implemented on our client's site. The data was shared with the relevant teams to show how traffic has fallen significantly following the implementation. And this data would have been really difficult to visualize without Google Data Studio Dashboard. And finally, here is a dashboard we set up for one of our clients who have a shop site. There are metrics in here that can be pulled through directly from Google Analytics, but also some custom graphs like revenue data over time that helped our clients understand the peaks in when certain products were bought. And we segmented this report based on the information that different teams and stakeholders needed, and it could be updated relatively quickly if needed. It's also worth pointing out actually that Google Data Studio dashboards update in real time. So every time you log in, it'll be new data that you're looking at. So it's worth remembering that data doesn't have to be hidden away in a tool that only a handful of people know how to use. It can be presented and reported in a way to ensure that it's visible to everyone and it underpins the decisions that you make about your organisation.
All right, that's it from us. Thanks so much for those of you who stuck around and listened. I know there's a lot of other stuff going on today, so I hope that this has got you thinking. We're not even at the middle of the week, and we've bombarded you with information about how to measure, where to measure, what to measure, why to measure. This stuff is all important, and it really will underpin the success of what you're doing. If it's not your natural sphere, if some of this stuff seems kind of intimidating, particularly the kind of practical stuff or the strategic stuff, then find someone at your organization who is interested in this, because there will be people out there who care about this and will be as interested in it as you are. And if you're working with third-party external agencies in any kind of capacity, then push them a little bit harder on the metrics that they're reporting to you. I think where we have organizations that push back on us about, like, so what, we like that too. You know, push your agencies harder, because they'll deliver better work if you ask them to go a bit deeper with those metrics. And critically, remember that none of the stuff we've shown today involves spending any money. I think that's really important. If you're an organization who is small, you can achieve all of this in exactly the same way that the bigger organizations on the session can do as well. So you need some logic, you need some organizational objectives, and you need a bit of common sense, and you're on your way. So thanks very much for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day. Please do get in touch if you have any more questions. phil@torchbox.com is my email address. You can come straight to me, and we can share out any questions you have between me and Amna. But that's it from us, and thanks very much for listening to us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.